Ready? Good. Hello, everyone. Well, it's a great pleasure to be present to introduce this talk. And I should say also, before I get on to the main subject, I'm speaking from Cambridge, and it's the occasion of the summer school of the Centre for Classical Study of Classical Architecture, sorry. And there's a new initiative. First of all, the centre was formed last October, and it's there's already a group of PhD students and a group of postdocs, and it's all a really exciting series of seminars. And now there's this summer school for actually teaching people about classical architecture. And I've had the pleasure of being part of it today, and I think last week for one talk. And here I am with Tiffany Abernathy, who will say hello.
Hello, everyone.
So that's a really nice connection, I think, also for everyone involved with traditional architecture to know that there is this initiative, and that that our passion can be taught in Britain as well as in, not just at Kingston and the occasional historian. And it's a great initiative. So I'm really pleased to be here and introducing the talk. Now that is the main meal. That's what we're here for. So it's really, I think, sort of great that Alireza Sagharchi is here to tell us about his important contribution to our field. So Alireza is the founder and the principal of Stanhope Gate Architecture, who will be well known to many of us, and produced a very impressive roster of buildings. And we're going to hear about a set of projects coming up soon. So I don't think I should say that much more, except as you can see on the opening screen there, we're going to be in for a treat. But I should say there's a couple of important connections for our networks. First of all, that Alireza was a past chairman of TAG, the Traditional Architecture Group. So that's, he's one of the, more than one of the tribe, he's one of the tribe chieftains. And then he's also a trustee of INTBAU. So that's another important function. So I think without any more ado, Alireza, if I can pass the floor over to you, and we're all going to be gripped by what you have to tell us about classical architecture, really over quite a large portion of the world, so not just here in Britain.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, the TAG, the Traditional Architect Group, my first refuge, if you like, for organizing the talk and giving me the opportunity to talk on behalf of my company. I share the office with three other directors, I should say, Zuba Debar, Simon Lillian, Jan Hauger, whom you know, is part of the running and organizer of TAG. So tonight what I want to do is really go through some essential and fundamental concepts and ideas which underpins the work of the practice. And that will be the preamble to the lecture. And then I will very quickly move on to some exemplar projects, just to show how what we look to in theory works in practice, and whether we are successful or not. And we can kind of wash our faces. That remains to be judged by others rather than us. And really, where we are coming from, I think the intention is on the box itself. It's to do with a contextual approach to classicism, and an architecture which speaks to many traditions, not just one, and also an architecture that represents many traditions. And that really is the kind of the cornerstone of the practice. We work, as Mark says, in something like, we have worked in something like 17 countries. And as you can imagine, the reason we get involved is because of the fact that we are able to intervene sensitively in contexts without offering a single vision or a single view or a single style of architecture that would fit all. And I think that's our kind of unique approach. And you will see the kind of the range of projects that we can demonstrate how that has worked in practice for us. So the cultures within which we operate or we work with, they have, as we've come to observe, really contain some transcendental values when you look at the context, when you look at the built form, the architectural heritage. And whilst they're quite diverse in the way they look, or they stylistically or representationally, how they build shelter, how they build their institutions, those kind of transcendental values go as a thread right through them. And the way they classify different building types, the way they look at different building types, the place that different building types has within the greater culture, the relationship between their vernacular architecture and their what we call high practice or classical architecture, that kind of runs as like a thread, whether you are practicing in North America or in China. And going from the canon high practice to the vernacular is a recurring theme that happens pretty much in every built culture, and it's not something that's exceptional to Western European classicism or European vernacular. So I'm just going to attempt the first jump in the slide to see if I can shift it. So yeah, as I was saying, that we work within very many contexts, and to somehow not get lost in the kind of the heat of practice and lose one's principles, one has to be quite strict and quite disciplined in the way one approaches the subject and the project in each case. And we do that by really, as I was saying, sticking to certain principles and certain fundamentals. The reason for that is that today you can actually say anything. An architecture is such a fragmented space that you can actually say anything and mean anything, and nobody can either criticize you or tell you whether you're wrong and your architecture is better than mine or my architecture is better than yours. I have a collection of very funny kind of statements which are from very eminent and some very serious architects. This is an example where the architect says, "My holistic claim has repeatedly confronted me with transcending artistic boundaries." I mean, I've racked my brains for many years to understand what that really means, and I can't really make it out. But apparently, it impresses a lot of people, and it says something. Or this, for instance, which is a department store, a famous department store somewhere. I think it's either in Manchester, and the architect says that the decorative treatment of the facade contextualizes the retail experience. So, and this is a very serious architect. This is not somebody who's kind of a pseudo-intellectual or someone who's frivolous. And this is a serious statement about somebody's architecture. It just shows that you can really say anything that you want. And it's not just the modernists or people who practice trends or are trendy that say these things. Classicists are just as guilty, or people who tend to practice some form of traditional architecture. For instance, in this one, this is clearly a panelized building, and the architect says that their design is inspired by the robust repetition and change that both late 19th century industrial buildings and contemporary office buildings exhibit. Now, and they also say they wanted to build in a manner that celebrates precast stone with its large tectonic scale. What they really mean is that they've panelized the building and been forced to panelize the building, and therefore have to live with the expansion joints. So I always call this slide, let who is without sin cast the first precast stone. So let's see. And really that's why, because the reason is that the nature of architecture has changed and architects have changed. We have gone from a human being to almost like a homo digitalis, and our attributes have changed from a human scale or rulers that talked about human scale to digitization, to the computer, and to industrial methods of building. And that, I'm not saying is a bad thing, but the thing is that the tools of the architecture are now mistaken for or define the value system. And that's something which we try to resist. The intervention of software or introduction of software doesn't necessarily inform or should inform the aesthetic of the building, or the possibilities of the metaverse, or the possibilities of constructing alternate realities should not really change the values. After all, human beings have evolved over millennia, but over the past 10,000 years, with every technological change, haven't really grown an extra arm or managed to feel different, heat differently, or feel cold differently. So certain fundamental ways of existing doesn't change regardless of the tools, but architects are expected to actually change their values and the way they represent human need, which is shelter, because their tools change. And really, architects don't know to what tune they should be dancing. They were always thought to be people of who would create humane environments, human scale, but now they are, as you can see with the famous sketch of Charles Eisen done for Anton Logia, of the primitive hut. The muse showing the cherub, the little cherub who's the architect, the primitive hut, or the origins of architecture. Now we have so many different ideas of where and how we should be practicing that the architects are completely in a state of fragmentation and confusion. And as I was saying, really, it's not just the modernists, but the classicists are actually guilty of it. I mean, these are some of the some buildings which are done in the name of traditional architecture, and you can see at the top on the top two are the buildings which are mass produced in China with a view of what classical architecture should be. And these are serious buildings. They, like 100,000 or 1,000 of these villas are built. The one on the bottom right always amuses me when I drive to one of our projects in Kuwait. It's called Villa Akbar, which means Villa the Great. And it has every possible element that actually stuck on it, or the kind of what I call freestyle developer classicism that you find in most developing countries on the bottom left. So this is really not only affecting the normal environment, it's also affecting people's perception of what proper building and constructing sound buildings is like. So everything has become an illusion and a kind of a pale imitation of itself. And that has created really a crisis of identity. And we all know what that means. I think people who subscribe to TAG or are part of TAG know that one of the main bones of contention or criticism that we level at the modern urban planning and modernist architecture is actually the loss of identity, whereby you could, if you remove the captions from any of these images, you wouldn't really be able to tell which is which or where is what, whether Houston and Dubai and other places merge, and you can get ski resorts in Dubai and you can get beaches, artificial beaches in the middle of the desert. So the possibilities are endless. But then again, that does not mean that identity has to be diluted. As I was saying, that the tools or attributes of the architect have changed, but the value system should not change. As we are able to build better, bigger, taller, that has actually created a crisis of identity. And these are things which are still getting built. And these are not buildings that they're not mistakes of the 1960s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or the noughties. These are, I mean, the building on the left was under construction when I took this photograph about 4 years ago. So you can see that identity has been reduced to the level of the sticker on the product. And with any marketing a campaign, the product can change, the label becomes more up to date, and it changes. And in this case, it happens to be tradition, and the architect wanted very seriously to propose that. And these things are they're mega million projects. They're not jokes. We might consider them to be that. boards of directors have approved the models. People have put huge finances. Thousands of people have worked for 2, 3, 4, 5 years in order to construct them. And the identity that's left for the context is really what the chaos is. And context really is very, very important. I think one of the first things that we look at when we approach a project, apart from its kind of tectonic or the availability of material or the appropriateness of the material or where it sits within an architectural culture, is actually context, because really context is the difference between order and chaos. I mean, the same boats that sit so majestically on water and create bucolic or romantic landscape, once the water goes away, they're just wrecks sitting on their sides, and they're beached. So a building out of its context, like a fish out of water, I guess, or a boat out of water, is chaos. What was the right context is the same object can also be beautiful. So there is appropriate place for modern building, glazed building, office buildings, but within the right context. And the same thing for traditional buildings. So once they're taken out of their respective context, or one stuck on the other one in order to represent a certain system of values, that's when problems occur. And you can see that really when you go back to core principles, i.e. traditional and classical architecture, there is such a richness and diversity of form, of building methods, of construction and tectonics. And for buildings, for cultures that have a rich vernacular tradition, you always find a rich classical tradition at the same time, because one inevitably leads to the other. And something that I have observed over working in very many countries and looking at architecture in different countries over many years, is that what tends to happen is that vernacular architecture, the styles and aesthetic and modes of construction, almost even down to small details sometimes, tend to converge depending on climatic similarities. So you will find traditional granaries in Norway, Spain, Iran, and Japan using thatch. They're in completely diverse geographical locations. Or the use of adobe, for instance, in building from New Mexico right the way to Pakistan, or using timber frame building from England to Turkey and Germany. So these almost raw reactions or responses to certain climatic conditions actually merge, because they're based on a nature-centered solution, and nature has limited palette. Actually, nature offers a very limited palette of construction. It offers stone, it offers timber, and actually those are the ones that you will find that once you respond to climatic conditions, styles tend to converge. Whereas on the other hand, with classical tradition, there is divergence of style, because the aesthetics and tectonics are this time based on a set of principles which are culture-based. And although remotely based to the vernacular or a climate of a place, they are more refined, more distinguished. They're to do with political culture, with singing, with painting, with a kind of a higher level of activity, artistic activity, and of which architecture is a part. So you will find Egyptian, Persian, Roman, Chinese, Greek classical buildings or classical traditions. These traditions exist, contrary to what we've been exposed to over the past 30 or 40 years, which is as classicist, which is really looking at quite a myopic and a narrow band of Western European or transatlantic classical culture. That once one goes into it, they're extremely sophisticated systems of proportion, tectonics in different cultures at the highest level, which are no more or no less valid or awe-inspiring, if you like, than the Roman Forum or the Theseum, the Erectreon, and they tend to be somehow glossed over as classical. And you can see, I mean, they even find expression like neoclassicists or the Renaissance or the Swedish Grace found expression in ancient culture. In 1920s Iran, people were building classical buildings which somehow represented the classical values and classical proportions of ancient Persian architecture. But then modernism entered the 20th century into developing countries or semi-industrialized or pre-industrialized countries, and actually shoved this kind of culture right aside and created a hybrid, which has led to those images that I was showing you, where we ended up pasting tradition on top of steel and glass buildings. So these cultures are still alive. You know, the spaces are still alive, and in terms of urban design as well as built culture. So we really look at a kind of a broad taxonomy of architecture in two different levels. One is the classical, and then the other vernacular. And what are the major distinguishing factors of these two is that the classical uses materials for durability, whereas the vernacular uses materials for expediency, and they're not as durable. The classical is responsive to geoclimatic condition, is not responsive to the geoclimatic condition, whereas the vernacular is born out of geoclimatic conditions. And the classical represents culture of forms. Vernacular, really, it represents a tectonic way of building, which is to do with expediency. And classical buildings tend to be superimposed on sites, in their sites, and they dominate the site, whereas vernacular buildings tend to work with the lie of the land, and they tend to blend into and that goes for planning at the level of vernacular as well as urban design for more civic buildings. And the classical aesthetic conveys a very disciplined tectonic, whereas the aesthetic of the vernacular emerges from an inventive and continually adapted culture, which is to do with availability and disposability and rebuilding. And the classical relies on abstraction of nature through tectonic and mode of construction, whereas the nature between the what is built, the form, and what is designed or not designed in the case of vernacular is quite raw. And the classical is really high tech by nature and functions and is at the height of sophistication of construction. But the vernacular is very low tech but highly intelligent, because it actually survives within a kind of a raw and natural context. So in terms of how these phenomena influence what we do and how we do it, I just will go through some projects in different contexts, and each of them won't probably address every element that I described, but they one aspect probably, if one aspect of these shines through and we've managed to hit the right note with the building, then I think that kind of for us is success. The first one is really an infill of a classical building. It's a new build building in London, in Mayfair, where this building was inserted into a terrace of a Victorian terrace and a kind of a partial Georgian terrace. The building that stood in its place before was a kind of a 1940s aberration. It wasn't a bad building, it was decent, but it wasn't quite right. The building that existed on that side was on the left. And if you tried to tell the planning authority today that you wanted to do something like that, you would be kicked out of their office at the first meeting. So we managed to make a case for really building a building that was in the memory of what was there before, and try to insert that by respecting the context, the scale, the level, the kind of the existence of the piano nobile, and the different grading of the different heights of the building, but still maintaining a special status of that building within a rather, if you like, anonymous terrace of building, so that the memory of that building still existed. The building was built out of solid stone ashlord masonry. It's not a clad building. You know, the walls are about 2 foot thick. with an inner leaf of concrete block. Simon Lilly, co-director, was in charge of this building, and in that we also tried to celebrate the kind of the lushness of carving of the stone with the coronas, with the over-door panels, and also look at various devices in order to scale the building. You will notice, for instance, in this building, this was the widest bay on the whole street. And if I go back to say, you see it's actually the widest building. And in order to not end up with large areas of blanks, we actually pulled the center of the building slightly further in order to deal with the difference between the width of the building on the two of this building and the buildings to the left and to the right of it. Going completely in a different direction, this is actually a villa in Kuwait, which is built along the lines of what we call kind of the vernacular architecture of that region. Some call it Islamic architecture, but I don't believe in that name, because there is such thing as Christian architecture, but that doesn't describe the architecture of anywhere, really. It describes the architecture of everywhere. In east and west of Constantinople, I suppose, west of Istanbul, I guess. But so this really is a kind of an architecture which belongs to a climate. It is vernacular, but it is also at the same time going slightly towards classical, in an architecture of courtyards, of reels of water, of shades, of not much fenestration, but then in order to obviate the large scale of volumes, there are recesses and there are interplays between different kinds of devices. So again, this is built with local stone, with with what we call musharabiyas, which give shade, buildings of different volumes and different scales, and it's an inward-looking building, a building that was built really in a very traditional way, even down to the scaffold that was erected around it. I mean, it wasn't a very short building, but it was my first encounter with timber scaffolding, and it works just as well as any other scaffolding. And this is the finished building. It's built in Syrian stone, and you see that really the blankness of the facades. There are very, very few windows because obviously the extremely harsh climate, the internal courtyards, the views. So it's a semi-open building which opens towards a park. Views at night, the internal courtyard with a carved marble Syrian fountain. The interiors are quite lush. There's a library, a triple height library to the side of the building, and the really the existence of water and how the water goes into different reels and then goes into from an open area into a semi-open area and then into and reappears in the fountain that I showed you within the internal courtyard of the house, makes the house cool. It also gives different spaces for different times of day to live in the house, because during the very hot day you will be inside. Early afternoon you could go into an internal courtyard where you'll be cool. During the evening you can actually venture out when the weather is too hot. Again, going to a completely different context. This is a resort, an eco resort on the Danube Delta in Romania, in the north on the Ukrainian border, where we had no context. It was just really nature, and we were given a brief to design a resort with some 40 or 50 odd rooms. So we conceived of the and this is quite an old project, and now it's become quite fashionable to do things in this way. When we did this first, we really conceived the whole project as a seaside village, as a fishing village on the side of the banks of the Danube, rather than a single object building, which is what would have been the kind of the modus operandi of people who wanted to build this kind of resort. So the main building acts as a beacon, as the main building of the village, with all the other buildings strewn around it. The site is quite sloping, as you can see from the drawing at the bottom, and the villas are very regularly promenading, facing the water, and the villas are very regularly placed. And you can actually see this in classical planning, where for instance in Anatolia and places like Escaplion, the Deccan and Cordomanus grid is superimposed onto quite a hilly landscape, and instant variety is created. Instead of seeing if you imagine, if you put a grid, urban grid, a regular urban grid on a flat piece of terrain, everything is straight. It's west, east, west. But once you superimpose that on top of a of a slope, you can actually get different views. You can get different elevations, people looking from one level over to the other. And here we explored different building types with the tower, which was for ornithologists, for people who wanted to watch the birds on the Danube Delta. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so the use of materials and building materials was quite sensitive. There was very little waste that could be created by the build work. And timber was used. Timber was really the predominant material, with some stone and some concrete. Again, another exercise in vernacular. This is a new built villa in the Alps. It's a chalet in the Alps. Here, again, the challenge of building in a climate with vernacular language of architecture. We started to learn why they're doing things like this. Why are the roof verges so thick? Why are stone slates 5 centimeter thick? And it's really because your architecture is just fighting the element. The aesthetic of the architecture is born out of fighting of the elements. That's why the roof is heavy. The corbels are enormous because the amount of the weight that you're carrying, and the slates have to be thicker than, heavier than a meter of snow that tries to slide off the roof and bring the whole roof down with it. So this, we try to get under the skin of this kind of architecture and to design within its language, or within the language of the architecture of that region. And I think people who confronted us first time when we were trying to present our design, they were quite skeptical that we would get it. But I think once you have that sensibility of trying to find out the reasons why things are done, and the aesthetics and the reason for the aesthetics and the construction techniques, then it becomes quite easy to almost compose. It's almost like learning a language, and you can see why things come out, why things need to be done at certain points, why the overhang needs to be so big, etc., etc. Another project which we have shown, I think I've shown it also in my book, is quite a large project, again in Western Spain, where we've looked at the kind of the classical language of architecture, of Spanish architecture, which is informed partly by building in a very deprived part of Spain, I should say, in Extremadura, where the conquistadores came from. These were very brave people who didn't know how to swim, but they went to Portugal, got on the boats, and went to South America. And when they came back, they built these fantastic cities like Cáceres, Trujillo in Western Spain. And the architecture is just amazing. You can see the kind of the local vernacular, if you like, which is a fusion of different styles of architecture, but all built quite solidly with architectural devices that are quite intelligent, respond to the climate, as well as represent the kind of the more classical values or the higher values of the communities that live with the projects. This is an equestrian project that was in the middle of an estate, where we had to design large maneges, stables, bull ring, all sorts of other facilities for the horses. And we came up with a parallel and taxonomy of buildings, which basically each represent their various function, and they gradually get more sophisticated, as you can see on the right hand side in the parallel, culminating in what we call the classical stables, which were for more expensive Andalusian horses, and a saddle museum in the center on the octagonal building. The monastery of Guadalupe is nearby, And that has actually a layering of so many different ages of building and different building cultures. And it's and the richness of the stone, the way the tiles they used, and there was plenty of local materials and local building techniques that could inform what we could or couldn't do in the region. The classical stables were really quite different once you entered into them to the outside, more kind of vernacular structures, which presented themselves to the countryside, it's kind of more refined atmosphere of the interior core than intramuros of the project itself. Going to Scotland, for instance, we came against a very specific, very extremely rich building culture, something that makes capital of austerity and an austere way of building without any sentimentalism, and again something to do with the climate. And this is on the island Jura, where we found a extremely modest house, which we had to enlarge in order to turn it into a kind of a country house, plus steadings, which were essentially cowsheds. You can see the main house sits here on a promontory on a estate which has like 16 miles of coastline, and a set of steadings near the house itself, which were essentially a series of cowsheds and milking barns. And we pretty much demolished these down to the ground, to the base. Some parts of it were listed. This is Great Sea listed, and we rebuilt by learning from the Scottish vernacular in order to see how the rules of composition of that kind of architecture, the response of that kind of architecture works in this kind of climate. So that is actually the kind of finished house, which is really an additive composition. You can just see the core of the house in the center, either left and right of the tower. We added a east wing to the house with a step-crow gable, a gallery connection with an arcade, and then a west wing to the house, and also expanded the house at the back. This is the sea-facing facade of the house, and this arched door at the bottom used to be the front door of the house. So we had to also reverse the way the house was approached. This is the house on approach, which a lot of Scottish baronial architecture is about the kind of romantic views of gables, of sculptures, of chimney breast, etc., and an additive composition. We try to emulate that kind of architecture. And looking at the old and the new, how both work together. This is another interest of ours, just to have a kind of a seamlessness between the language of what was there before and continuing the story of the house itself. The new gable on the right, in the right image, the new entrance, which is kind of non-sentimental classicism, I would call it. It's kind of robust, very nicely crafted. These are all solid stone pilasters, capitals, pediments, etc. But they're not overly worked. And then different structures. You can see the entrance volume of the house and the views towards the sea, capitalized by large oriel windows. These are the steadings, which were really a series of structures that had to be taken down substantially, and then a new community of buildings created out of them, inserting a new gabled parts to these. These were really low buildings with small openings. A new gateway building, pedimented gateway building. These were built with field stone, which was found on the island, and a troop of masons who moved in for the best part of a year and a half. This was project by our director, Zuba Debar, who was in charge of it. And we created a community of buildings with houses and small guest accommodation and accommodation for people who would run the estate. It's quite a sizable estate. Looking at different stones, reusing stones, using field stones, merging old and new together, but all the gables, all the interventions, the roofs and everything, the windows that have been put on above, the arches, etc., are new. So it's repurposing and adding, again, in a seamless way. This project is which is a completed project in Val d'Europe, near the Disney park, which was really a housing project, where we exercise really a kind of an urban design classicism, if you like, of a community of buildings which house different apartments, but they don't look like apartment blocks, and they sit as buildings which face a park, almost like the buildings that sit in Regent's Park facing the green of Regent's Park. It's in a place called Quartier Anglaise, unsurprisingly, which is the English quarter outside of the park. These are developer houses sold to the local community, and we have tried to create a variety of streetscapes, buildings of different size, different scale, different tenancies, in 7 buildings, which house something like 143 apartments, 47 of which are affordable. And this is one of the affordable blocks, the building with the render, white and yellow render is one of the affordable blocks. It's been very well built by the local contractor. It's mainly render with concrete painted cornices and metal projection, weathering. This is another building which is a villa, really sitting within a greenfield site. It's in Surrey, built out of solid stone masonry, where we were trying to emulate or think of how Nash may have approached a building of this nature, where the rear is slightly more abstracted in terms of its classical treatment than the front, and then it's still a much more austere pool house building to the right hand side of it. Again, the interest here was also trying to mix different tectonics. So these are steel columns which actually hold up the stone, and this is built in solid stone masonry by Ketton. Stone, I'm sure, is known to a lot of you. Hand carved stone, and the external wall is an ashlar wall of 325 millimeter thick stone and brick. And again, here the aesthetic the interest was to see how we can recreate the aesthetic and the lushness of the stone, and then try and mix it with a tectonic of steel columns and stone buildings. This is a project that's under construction at the moment, and I'll finish in about 10 minutes, I think. And this is near the previous project that I showed you in France. It's an urban block of what we call faubourg building. These are buildings that were originally outside on the suburbs of Paris, which then, when Paris expanded, became part and parcel of the aesthetics of Parisian buildings. So this is a mixed-use block of a perimeter block with retail on all the edges where you see in blue, and then housing where the entrances are in white, and a series of mews houses at the back and within the block. So these are 2 views. Pierre Carle Bontempi, who may be known to some of you, is having a project on towards this side of it, and behind it is John Simpson's housing project on the same in the same area. So these are some of the photos of the buildings under construction. Again, you see a different variety of buildings with various shops and retail units on the lower ground floors, and following the aesthetics of the French faubourg. These are rendered facades with cornices and mansards. Again, the quality of the work is extremely good. It's essentially render with stone dressings. This is a project in Kuwait again, with where we looked at the aesthetic of a kind of a Mesopotamian almost architecture, which is slightly different diverges from the first building that I showed you in Kuwait. It's a volumetric tour de force for us, because the building was on a very tight site, but had a lot of area to be stuffed into it, but still needed the same thing in terms of a courtyard, of shading, So we created almost two buildings, which engulfed a small courtyard between the two. You can just about make it out on the left-hand side image. The entrance, again built in a whitish stone from the region. The detailing is really the relief is very light because the shadows are so intense that even a 2 millimeter step in the stonework gives you a huge shadow. You don't really need to do a lot of hard work in order to create and break up surfaces, which would otherwise be, you can see on a large facade like that, there are very few windows. And that's really all to do with the climate. So you try to play around with various devices in order to create interest by geometric shapes, breaking up large cornices or lines, or where windows would be expected and you can't actually put windows. This is another project which is again looking at how a classical building will sit within a greenfield site in the Caucasus. And this is really a kind of a play on the Palladian villa, because we have the same pediment actually appearing on the four facades of the whole house, but it's actually stretched on a single story. These the interest here for us was obviously try to see how Nordic neoclassicism actually, which works in a kind of a very harsh climate, which this was also the same context, how it deals with buildings, and in terms of the detailing of the roof. When we designed this, we had buildings of Hansen in Austria in mind almost, and the Ionic order of the villa came from their Echelon, and we had these basically carved by local masons who were familiar because they built their classical buildings mainly in a kind of a classical aesthetic that was developed probably only starting about 100 years ago in that country. And the roof is of a copper sheet roof with copper acroteria that goes round in order to give relief to otherwise a relentless long copper gutter, and the building just sits slightly above the table of the land, the flat land around it. The quality of the work was amazing. The local masons, I mean, they're solid, huge. You can see the scale of the capital and the person. It's about half the height of the person standing next to it, and these were carved by the local masons and lifted into place. Internally, the building has a kind of a slightly Art Deco feel to it. We designed an atrium, which actually we made a model, and the model made it to the Tag Salon. Didn't make it to the Tag Salon de Refusé and made it into the Royal Academy actually, which was interesting. Now, this is one of the latest projects we have on the board at the moment. This is waiting to go on site. Project with one of our directors, Simon Lilly, in the office. And this is Branch Hill House. It's in Hampstead, sits on top of Frogmore. It's an old Edwardian building which has been much messed around with the 1960s building right next to it. We have planning permission to demolish that building and lower the ground around the existing mansion, which is an old people's home, and add to it and we decided to really follow the what we call the Hampstead vernacular, which is the buildings of Norman Shaw, and also somehow informed by the buildings that were here before that, a kind of a Tudoresque almost language of brick and stone that was used for a lot of the buildings in Hampstead. So you can see on the left-hand side the actual house itself, the core of the house, to which we added and made symmetrical, and then a series of buildings which kind of follow the lie of the land. And this sits on a promontory, so everything below it there's nothing above this building. This building sits on the top of the hill. And on the bottom left, you can see the famous Branch Hill Estate, which is an award-winning 1960s stepped concrete building. So this is the design. This is our design. So you can see the bones of the old house, to which we have carried out some cosmetic surgery, exposed its basement, added a tower. So you can see the tower that's been added, that's a new tower. And then a kind of a Tudoresque local vernacular building, almost like what Norman Shaw may have done, containing around, I think, 40 apartments with some affordable units. And the building goes up towards the gate, and this is the internal view and the view on the other side. So these are some compositional studies of the facades. It's a brick and stone building. I should say reconstituted stone building with some carved stone elements, because they just wouldn't make sense to do reconstituted, with natural clay and natural brick, obviously built in limestone as far as I know, in lime mortar rather, not limestone. And this is the view towards the hill down, looking towards the west of London. So the existing building on the left, to which we've added a lower terrace section. The left of the building is a replica of the right of the building. The existing building is not symmetrical. And a new building on the right, which is partially an affordable block. This is an exercise really in a kind of a fancy Art Deco architecture for a villa that is under construction at the moment. And due to COVID, we haven't been able to travel there for some time. And we tried to really redefine the kind of the classical villa, and to see how was it that Art Deco became the kind of the language that it did, and how it evolved. And we found that really it's all to do with the same kind of classical sensibility, the way the proportion of the porch, the volumes, except the openings are obviously much wider, and there's a mixture of language of the classical language, and also the architecture of abstraction of art that Art Deco offers. And for us, it was quite interesting to do studies in how that would translate in render and in stone. This is a building which is just about finished, and it's a complex of buildings of a grand classical villa with a sitting on a promontory, plus two structures that flank it, a greenhouse and also a pool house. So these are some pictures of the building during construction. It sits in a sorry, this was snowing when I took the picture. Again, this is a this is a northern European style climate context. The buildings that kind of have very Germanic neoclassical references. The Doric order is from the Temple of Theseus in Athens, Thesion, I think call it. Again, here the use of copper, the carving of the stone done by local masons, and the tectonics of building in that climate. Again, you can see with copper roofs with rails to stop the ice sheet separating from the roof itself, and really building carved stone and carved detailing, which was of interest to us. Again, mixing metal and stone together, metal bays, etc. Pictures were taken in winter. And that's really it. I think really what I just wanted to say is that you've seen a very diverse and divergent set of drawings. One could almost, maybe even if one wasn't kind of level a kind of an eclectic stick onto it, but it's really to do with sensitivity to context. It's to do with the sense of what we think is appropriate, and not a one size fits all, and being sensitive and respecting the context and a sense of the appropriate, whilst really trying to understand the language and the tectonic of the local culture and trying to speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alireza. That was fantastic. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts on the distinction between classical and the vernacular, and hear your criticism about the state of architecture today, and just to walk us through your global tour of different projects done to such a high standard. I'm just impressed you were able to find so many amazingly talented stonemasons everywhere. So I have a lot of questions, but just wanted to say, everyone who has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box, or just turn on your video, sorry, turn on your mic and ask a question in person. Does anyone off the bat have any questions to start with? Otherwise, I'll ask one of my own. So I wanted to ask, in light of the international nature of your portfolio, so many questions come to mind. The language differences, the degree of precedent study that you have to go through to be able to detail things appropriately, in the contextual nature of your design approach, and also just quality control. The fact that you're here, and having done some international projects myself, I know that quality control element can easily fall apart. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you are able to approach international work to make sure that the quality is maintained and
Sure.
you're able to study the precedent fully?
Yeah, I mean, from my own background, as you know, I worked with the Institute for Fair Arts for many years before I set up my own practice. we always had projects abroad, and you being American probably might be much easier for you, because in the US you can't practice in another state unless you have an office in that state, and you have to go through a local architect. So what we do is exactly the same. We find, obviously a client finds us, we go in search of an architect who, if he's not necessarily a classicist, somehow subscribes to the culture and our approach, and we work with them. You know, my fellow directors, our associate directors, Pablo and other people who've been working on these projects, they travel once a month, once every 2 months, and it somehow came natural to us. We're all, I think we've got something like 15. We speak about 12 languages in the office, and we have many nationalities: Americans, Iranian. Pretty much every continent is covered by us, and for us, traveling is not daunting, and working in different environments is not daunting. A lot of people who come to work in London come from countries outside of the UK. So I think quality control is an issue, and it's an art. It's also quite frustrating in some respects, but somehow rewarding. I mean, I've been to Kuwait, where people have carved anthemions for me, as well as to Kazakhstan and Keton Stamford. So it's but you know, the Mason's mind works exactly the same. That's what I say. When something is human-centric, it is not, things come naturally. When you try to teach somebody or expect somebody to produce an industrial product, that's when you fail. People don't fail because stone is the same everywhere. But if you expect somebody to make an aluminium window with Germanic precision that comes out of the Schuko factory, somewhere out in, I don't know, somewhere which is semi-developed, the two products look completely different. And that's where technology fails, industrialism fails. But human nature doesn't fail. The carpenters, you know, in Japan, or the carpenters in India are just as good and just as crafty and inventive as are the stonemasons, as are the bricklayers. I mean, the brickwork in places like Turkey, Iran, and Central Asia, I know Simon's been there recently, is just mind-blowing. You know, the vaults that they still build. They still build domino buildings with brick vaults. They put steel filler joists because concrete is scarce. They built a steel domino structure, but because concrete is scarce, they put filler joists every 1200 and build brick vaults between the I-beams. So, you know, the inventiveness is there. So you just need to really tap into it.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, Scott's got his hand up.
Thanks, Diana. Ali, do you think there's I mean, in the general principle of doing this kind of work, I kind of always felt there's a phenomenological aspect to it. In other words, you know, the things that we make buildings of always want to be what they want to be. So I was quite pleased when I was thinking this through. And then you mentioned the idea about, you know, stonemason is a stonemason in every country, and they know what stone is. And I think that's very telling. Whereas, you
when you looked at the example of the, I think that was that project in Nottingham with the lace,
Yes.
plastered all over the lace pattern, plastered all over the John Lewis store, and that is like an application of a symbol onto a building, which isn't really, you know, a building. It's a decorated box in kind of all the wrong ways in some sense. So the first question is just materially the phenomenological aspect of things wanting to be what they want to be. And well, what's the best way of doing that? It's doing that in a, you know, traditional vernacular manner that allows those materials to be expressed appropriately, which then takes us to the other issues about how you make a window, how you make a door, what's the meaning of a threshold, walking through an opening into, you know, from a public realm into a semi-private to a private realm, and all those things that aren't really thought about today. And, you know, your earlier examples of those buildings, which were just, you know, glass sheets of, and then you create a threshold by sticking a symbol on the front of it in the terms of an ionic, you know, kind of colonnade. So I thought it was really kind of telling and very interesting, and that kind of relationship between things wanting to be what they really want to be, and that then leads us to, well, people always knew how to do that very well, and why don't we keep using and learning those lessons, you know, moving forward?
Yes, I think so. And you will find every culture has a slightly different way of doing things. They all do the same thing, you know. They all want, I mean, every human being wants. So when we build a house for a client, it's because they either fell in love, got married, or having children, and it's the same story everywhere else. Or it's an institution who wants to house something, but they all have slightly different ways of doing things. You know, they look at their privacy in a different way. You know, and as I said, it's always the context. Context is king in what we do, and it informs you of a lot of things. And that's why we've always had this. I wouldn't say. I don't know what the right word is. What we haven't done is really do the same thing everywhere else. This is what we haven't done, and I think there's a place for that. But I think what I don't want to do, me as a traditional architect or as a classicist, I don't want to be defined by that approach to building. I want to be eclectic. I want to be able to, you know, speak in the language of the country I step into, rather than speak my own language wherever I go. I was looking at some buildings in Milan some time ago, and I was walking past them, and I saw this beautiful sculptured building. I was going to include a photograph of it, and somebody told me, "Oh, that's a concrete building. It's a 1920s building. It's one of the most famous buildings in Milan, which was built entirely in concrete. It's an Art Nouveau building, so it's called." In Italy they call it the Liberty style. It's kind of a liberation of architecture, and it's amazing. And I thought, well, what an amazing opportunity to be able to work with that and to do that. But then the proportions, the blocks, or where it was used was always appropriate, and it worked. The sculptures worked. And it's a very traditional, you look at it, anybody who doesn't go close up to it more than 20 meters thinks it's a stone building, but it's not a stone. And I said, we've been almost like people who are bitten by a snake and are afraid of a little rope they see. We've been scared of touching concrete. We've been scared of touching materials which are perceived not to be kind of traditional in a way, and there's a lot of opportunities missed. And I think the same thing goes about architecture. You know, practicing in different countries, there's such a rich culture of building, of classicism, of belief in fundamental transcendental values. Everything means something. Every piece of decoration on a building means something. And to kind of push all that aside, you say, well, you can either have modern buildings which are made out of steel or glass, or you can have a classical building like a Greek villa that you will find in a bank in in the Americas, you know, that then if you are building a bank in Doha, that's what you do. You build a glass building, and like they do in Houston or wherever they did it, you stick a classical temple on the front of it, and then you get tradition and modernity at the same time.
I think Jana has a question as well.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm wondering, does your clients usually come with a brief for traditional classical architecture, or you manage also to persuade them for classical traditional, or because your company is classical traditional, you have the same clients? It's because from colleagues, some older colleagues, I often hear, well, we don't build this anymore because there is no brief for it. And I'm wondering, like, how to make it happening more. Is it possible to persuade client? Because of course the budget, the brief which they're expecting, and because yeah, on my view, it also has so much positive things, so much possibilities which are kind of forgotten in our world, and how to make it like more to persuade the client for traditional classical.
Yeah, I mean, I would lie if I said that no, they're all modernists and I've converted them, you know, like an evangelist. You know, they said, hallelujah, yes, I'm a classicist. But no, it does not. They come to us because they also have an innate sense of what is appropriate. Our commercial clients come to us really not because they're dedicated classicists. They come to us because they know traditional architecture is the best, will offer the best value of their investment. You know, the resort or the people, we're recently working on quite a major project I can't talk about. And the client is convinced that to do traditional architecture will increase his investment and will reflect the brand value that he has. Yeah. So in the commercial world, it's to do with the return. And they're very hard-nosed about it. With the private individuals, really they come with a sense of what is appropriate. And what we do is we try to contain them. If they're shy, we encourage exuberance. If they're exuberant, we encourage moderation and temper what they want to do. So they bring us a series of jots, if you like, or writings, and we try to make a story out of it and read the story back to them. In a way that has a pleasing narrative, and then they buy into it. After all, it's not easy to persuade people to get stone carvers and spend that kind of money. These are private clients, obviously, who are well heeled in a way, in a certain sense, but the commercial ones are not. The project in Scotland is used partially as a hotel, partially as a private house. So, but nobody wants to go to Scotland and live in a Palladian, stable or in a building that they don't think is appropriate to the context of a remote Scottish island. They want to see Scottish vernacular, and the brand that promotes that, makes money out of it, wanted that, and that's what.
Yeah. Thank you. I have one more question. I don't know if I can answer. We don't have much time. Ask or
let's do one more. Yeah, why not?
So yeah, you just mentioned that you often also do the solid wall construction. I was wondering, is it also clients? You don't perceive client want to have solid wall because he knows the value of it, or like how do you avoid cavity walls?
No. Look, we build cavity wall buildings. There's no other way. You can't build solid wall. They won't pass the code. But what we do is we've done that. I mean, the first time I did that was in Oxford, for Magdalen College, where a college came back and said, we want a building. And in those days, everybody said all buildings were built to a specification of a lifespan of 80 years of investment. So, in 80 years, you're expected to demolish the building and rebuild. The college came back and said, we want a building that would last for over 300 years. So now a building does not stay as it is, especially built in this day and age, for 300 years. And then it's a monument. It's not a building after that. It's unusable after the first 100, 150 years. If it's preserved. So we decided to build a building where the outer shell can be kept in the same way we do facade retention nowadays. And the inner shell the inners can be taken in and out and refurbished every 150 years without having to demolish the building. Now, with a modern building, you can't do that. So we devised a system of two walls almost existing side by side. So the external wall in most of the projects that we do are self-supporting solid stone walls. So they're 325 millimeters thick, 415 millimeters thick, to not less than 215 millimeters if they're just brick. And the inner leaf can be concrete column, concrete frame, steel frame, whatever it is. So the external wall stands by itself, even if you, with some support and encouragement, of course. But you don't have to demolish the building to renovate it. So they're all cavity buildings, really.
Great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Alireza. I think that's all the time we have today. We appreciate you taking your time out this evening, even though it's beautiful and sunny outside, to come speak to us. And thanks to everyone who stayed with us as well. Just a heads up, for next month, we do have the Past Treehouse Prize winner on guard to speak to us about his work in Thailand. So our globe tour continues. Thanks again so much, Alireza, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.